Hello, everybody. My name is Melissa Prevost, and I'm a senior admissions consultant with Stratus Admissions. Give you a little background about myself before I jump in. I have been with Stratus almost 7 years, which is crazy. Feels like yesterday that I started. My background I was engineering undergrad. Spent some time doing consulting, and then went back to business school and worked at Home Depot for about 7 years as a director of strategy, and then lived abroad for a little bit and came back. And all through that time post MBA, I was an international interviewer. So wherever I was interviewing for Haas. And part of the reason I became an admissions consultant is I found that every time I was interviewing someone, there was a nugget of information that I was trying to get and wanted to hop across the table and be able to help others on their story. So I found a way to do that. I love meeting and talking with people about their MBA plans and helping them craft their best story. But we are here today to talk about best tips for how to write a great recommender, have your recommender write a great recommendation. And one more before I jump into that, I just want to give you a little background on Stratus. We're a full service admissions consulting group. What I think is a little unique about Stratus is we have a team-based approach. So often when we do these, we have someone else kind of bantering with us, but we work together in the background very closely. And through our process, we bring in our teammates to get another set of eyes on in your application. And we also have a 4-school guarantee. So if you work with us on 4 schools and are not successful in round 1, this is just for round 1, then we'll work with you in another 2 schools for no additional cost in round 2. So all that background aside, I want to encourage you to bring in your questions. I've got some high-level information that I want to start with just to give everybody a good frame of reference on recommendations, but I really also want to be answering your questions. So please feel free to add them in, and I will take a break from where I am and address them, but continue to answer your questions along the way. So recommendations. This is sometimes the most nerve-wracking part of an application because it is out of your control, right? Your work experience and quant background are history. Essays are in your control. You're writing them. The recommendations are the one piece. So you just want to give a little background and recommendations for MBA programs. So most schools are going to look for 2 letters of recommendation. There are a couple schools that have gone down to 1, MIT being one of them. And most schools also use the GMAC common letter of recommendation as the basis for the recommendation that they're asking. So you can look that up and know the questions. Most schools actually post their questions on their site as well. So that can be beneficial. So for instance, Stanford, MIT, and Columbia use the actual kind of letter of the GMAC common letter of recommendation. But there are some schools that use a hybrid of it. So Harvard uses the same questions, but slightly slower word count or fewer word count. Kellogg uses the questions, adds one of their own. Same with Haas. So some variation. Wharton is the one that is a little bit different. You can find their questions on their website, but they're asking, how would you contribute in the classroom, and what success will you find in your career? So I got a question here. So we're going to jump into kind of, it's perfect timing on who should be your recommenders. So the question is, can letter recommendations be taken from clients or any other agency? So Sampath, thanks for that question. I think we'll add in that link here in the chat shortly, the letter of recommendation format that's recommended. Again, schools are most likely looking for 2 recommenders. One, they would like to be your current supervisor, and the second could be someone who is hierarchically above you, or as Sampath has mentioned, potentially a client or someone external that you work with directly. What's more important is that your recommender knows you well. So hierarchy in an organization. So say you go ask your CEO, but have never worked with your CEO before. That's not going to be as much value for you is as is your supervisor, because your supervisor can speak more in detail to the kind of the work that you've done, and schools are looking for that detail. So, I've worked with some people who can't use their supervisor. Either they're up for a promotion or, can't disclose with their employer that they're applying. And this is where, it's kind of being creative in identifying who else. Is there someone else in the organization maybe that you've worked with that you could confide in, or going to a prior employer, or as Sampath mentioned, clients are often, if you have clients that can speak to kind of the work product. So it just got a question about can a prior boss give an LOR? I'd say yes, as long as they're in the recent past. So, if they're much more than 3 to 4 years out, then it's not going to give the best representation of your most recent work, because I would presume that you've done more in the last 3 to 4 years, but it's definitely someone to consider. So let's talk a little bit about the format and kind of what's covered within the letters of recommendations. Just so you know logistically how this works is you will open an application for each school, and within that application, there'll be a tab or a link that says recommenders. You will type in the email address of your recommenders, and the school will actually send a link to your recommenders. So it's a kind of a web-based format that they are filling out for each of the schools. So from there, so I've gotten a couple questions about kind of the format of an LOR. So the format can differ based on kind of the portal side of the school. However, the components are almost always the same. And so I often recommend that a recommender use Word or Google Docs to do kind of the writing side of what they're going to do, and then they can copy and paste into the text boxes that will be similar. So what's covered? There are kind of 3 main areas that are going to be covered in the recommendation. One is how long they've known you. The second is a leadership assessment. So it's a number of grids where your recommenders are rating you, and the 5 things that you are rated across are achievement, influence, people, kind of your people skills, and then your personal skills, which is a little bit like adaptability and resilience, and then cognitive, which is kind of quant side of things. So let's see. So I think that's the format. I've got, can one of my recommenders be my direct manager from 6 years ago, and the other is my manager from a year ago if I can't get my current manager? I think if you've got someone that's a year ago, then that can be a close proxy for the recent boss. And often what you'll want to do if you're not using your current manager, but using one from a year ago, is in an optional essay, explain why you've made that choice. And it can be, reasonings from, again, as we talked about kind of promotion, it could be you haven't worked with them as closely. One of the things I'm seeing more often now is people starting new jobs in COVID and they haven't actually worked in person together. So, you just want to be explaining to admissions why it is that you've chosen the people that you have. 6 years ago is not a bad thing. It kind of all depends on kind of what the options are. What you might want to also consider is if there's anyone else tangentially, so maybe somebody that you've supported on projects, or that you might dotted line into, or have worked with closely but isn't a direct manager that's more recent, that might be more powerful than someone 6 years ago. If your direct manager 6 years ago is someone you've stayed in contact with, so maybe you could say they've been a mentor since that time and you've kind of maintained that relationship, then that would strengthen the recommendation itself, because they'd be able to potentially speak to your growth over the last 6 years. So that's some things to take into consideration. So let's jump into kind of keys to a good recommendation. So I think there's kind of 4 key things to think about as you are preparing for your recommendations. Number 1 is kind of nurturing the relationships that you have with your potential recommenders. So maybe at this point you are creating a short list. So, could be, 3 to 4 people, maybe even 5 that you would consider. And I think a nice step before you're officially asking them is maybe to have a career conversation with them. Talk to them about the fact that an MBA is a part of your path. Engage their interest and their excitement for you. I had a client once who had this conversation with their boss, and their boss said, "You don't need an MBA. Why are you going to get an MBA?" So we found someone else. So you're looking for someone who you know is going to be your cheerleader and is going to be your champion through the process. And if they don't see this as a part of your career path, you might want to reassess and find someone else. So, from that kind of, I call that a soft ask conversation, then you could go on to a formal ask. And we suggest that you ask recommenders, say 6 to 8 weeks in advance to give them enough time. If you were looking at round 1 at this point, the first deadline that we've seen, and generally it's the first deadline of the year, is Harvard and September 7th. So, if you are getting kind of a formal documentation, and we'll talk about kind of suggestions there shortly, you're looking at kind of mid-July for round 1, maybe a little bit later, if some of the schools that you're looking at have later deadlines. I also recommend sometimes giving them a deadline that's maybe a little bit earlier. So September 1st for kind of September schools, just explaining, hey, I'm trying to get all my package together and done before the deadline itself. And it sometimes alleviates some stress at the very end. So I just got a question. Can my past boss who is retired been my recommender? Absolutely. So, again, time away from this person is probably the bigger indication, but if they've retired, that's fine, as long as they, you still have a relationship with them and they can speak to your time working together. The one thing schools would prefer, and this is a little bit different, it isn't possible with retired, is to have a professional email, or that you are in that link that you're sending to the recommender, that it's a work-based email. With retirees, obviously that's not the case. So they may do some additional due diligence just to ensure that this person is who they say they are, because anybody can set up a Gmail. But and again, this is where you want to use the optional essay to explain, and almost always in that same recommender area, there is a place for, why did you choose this recommender? So each school asks this a little bit differently, but you can also use the optional essay. Diva asked if there's a presentation that you can get access to for this session. So we have, we give a presentation called 4 Steps to a 5-Star Recommendation. So you can head to our website and take a look at that as well. Let's see. Should we ask our recommenders to share a draft for our consultants to review before submitting? Okay, PK, I'm going to get to that. Great question. And then my career coach can be recommender, but she's never worked closely with me, although she knows my career growth very well. So Kulangu, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Great question. And then PK, we're going to come back to yours. So a career coach, what you're really looking for is someone who can speak to the impact that you've had on an organization. More often than not, that's someone that you have kind of done work directly with. So yes, a career coach can speak to your trajectory, but they're probably going to have less examples of kind of personal examples to speak to on kind of how to describe your work ethic and describe how you are amongst your peers, because your career coach's peers are very different. So that would be one that I'm not sure, again, depending upon your other options, but I'm not sure that they would rise to the top. So let me jump to the kind of thinking strategically, which is kind of our next point on kind of the 4 steps. And this, PK, is somewhat coming to your question, but what I suggest you do is do a kind of a thorough kind of think about your strengths and what you versus the average candidate at the schools that you're applying to, and think about kind of where you shine and where you might have opportunities. And you want to think about strategically in choosing your recommenders, who are going to be able to speak to your strengths and who might have some insight that isn't going to come out in your essays or your resume, that might help give some indication of kind of where you shine, but it might not be evident in other parts of your application. So a great example there is quant skills. So if you don't have a quantitative background and you don't work in a quantitative role that's easily understood, then having your recommender speak about your quant skills is something that can go a long way, because it's a third person, right? So you can talk in your application about your quant skills, but having that come from a third person can be much more powerful. So, in thinking through, where you want to shine, this is where kind of choosing your recommenders and helping identify who it is that can be that champion for you in areas that you need. So the third piece is kind of sharing information, what you want to, and this is kind of in that 6 to 8 week time frame after you've had that soft ask, is kind of sharing information with your recommender. So, why you're looking for an MBA, why now, what specific schools you're applying to and the deadlines, and provide them your resume. There are, supplying this information helps your recommender understand why it is you're going to get an MBA. You don't want to assume that they know what you're looking for from an MBA and what your career goals are. So providing this information can be really helpful. And if you are working with a consultant, they could be a second set of eyes, similar to them being a second set of eyes on your essays. They could be a second set of eyes to ensure that a support network to your recommender. What you don't want is you don't want to be reviewing your recommendation. So you want to be able to check the box very with a clear conscience that you have not reviewed recommendation. We also suggest that you check to not, that's the wording, it's escaped me, sorry, it's Monday, but to not not want to review your recommendations later. Waive your rights. Thank you. Waive your rights. So, and this can be different across cultures, but in the US, it can be viewed as not trusting your recommender if you do not waive your rights. So we recommend that you waive your rights to see recommendations in the future. So PK, to your question, if you're looking for a second set of eyes to ensure that your recommender has is covering what what you're hoping to, then they can be your consultant could be a guide there. Kashish, can I ask my ex-manager who has recently switched the company for an LOR? Absolutely. And this is, as we're seeing during COVID over the last couple of years, this is happening a lot. So this is where there's been a lot of movement. You'll just want to explain when you did work together and kind of the relationship that you had at the time. So again, especially if they're recent and have been, a lot of, I would say, under a year of experience is maybe a rule of thumb. If you've been working with a current manager and don't feel like you've had the opportunity to kind of develop a strong relationship with that current manager, that reaching out to a prior manager can make a lot of sense. Especially if you worked with that prior manager for a longer period of time, to have someone that can really showcase your strengths. And then the fourth tip, so tips, again, we're nurturing relationships, thinking strategically, sharing the right information with your recommenders, and then trusting the process. So, your portal will show you the status of where your recommendation stands. And, I would not recommend kind of every week asking your recommender how they're doing. Maybe set a time limit, 2 weeks before the date that you ask them to have it complete. If it's not complete, then check in with them and see what help they might need. Again, this is where kind of having an initial conversation earlier and really gauging the willingness of your recommender to help you can be really valuable. I had a client this year who she was applying through the consortium, so she needed 3 recommendations, and there was one person individual that she really wanted a recommendation from. She had worked with him the longest. He had seen a lot of growth. He had just had a baby and had a reorg at work. He was very busy, and she could sense that from the beginning, but kept trying to kind of get him to offer to support. And he was kind of passively saying yes, and in the end, she had to find someone, and she had she had a person on backup, but I think if she had read the signs earlier on, then she would not have kind of waited to ask that backup. And it all worked out in the end. But you can really, that's where I think an initial conversation can really help you gauge. So one more question. From PK. I'm a male candidate from finance. Do you think strategically choosing recommenders based on a diverse background could help? For example, female minority VP who I worked closely with, or another VP male who might also write a good review, all things equal. So all things equal, I think you want to think about how you showcase your skills overall. And so, having people with diverse backgrounds write your recommendations, I think if everything's equal, is something to take into consideration. Now, if what's more important is to have the people that are writing recommendations know you well, but based on your example, if it's someone you worked closely with and would write a wonderful recommendation, then I think that absolutely, that probably trumps some of the diversity aspects. But if all things are equal, I think thinking through how are you going to showcase that you can and do succeed in diverse environments, this is one way that you could help showcase that. So, other things to take into consideration, what are some don'ts on recommendations? You don't want to write your own recommendation, and you don't want to write your recommendation and just have your recommender sign it. This is, this is coming back to, you want to find someone who's going to be your champion. One side is, schools are looking for this and they know that it happens. And so they are developing, software to help search these things out. That shouldn't be the reason you're not doing it. You should have people that are, that want to be your champion, and can, those who, in the guidance that you are providing your recommender, you might talk to them about the strengths that you're trying to highlight. And you might have some examples that you share that you think show those strengths, but they probably, if they know your work well, they're going to have some other great examples, and be able to think of it from a different perspective. And this is what's important to come through on a recommendation, is these different perspectives, and really be able to showcase where you shine, and be able to add kind of additional information to your overall candidacy. So just to kind of put in perspective, how to think about the recommendation in context of kind of the entire application. Schools are going to be kind of looking across 5 things. So you've got your kind of your quant skills, your work experience, your community involvement, your letters of recommendation, and your essays, or your goals trajectory, and how's this kind of come together. So, as I talked about thinking strategically, you can think around these 5 items and really how do you strategically think across your application to bring out your strengths, and where can your recommenders really add to those strengths? So Ankur has got a question: should the LOR be 100% error-free? English is not my first language, and my recommender is not very good at English. So great question. Schools are much more interested in content than they are whether or not the grammar is perfect. So the examples that your recommenders provide, showing how, the impact that you've had at work is going to be much more valuable. And this is something that we've heard consistently across schools. So, they would much rather have you choose someone who knows you well and can speak, strongly to your experiences, than look for someone that has perfect English if the perfect person doesn't have perfect English. There are opportunities to do translations as well. You could reach out to a school if that is going to be, generally you need to get the recommendation translated into English, but there are options there as well. But if the recommender's English is solid, then that's, definitely want to use that person if they're the right person, rather than finding someone else just because of their English abilities. So just kind of thinking about some other information that would be helpful. So the questions, I'm just realizing I didn't cover this, the free form questions. So there's kind of three areas that are in the recommendation. One was how long they've known you. Second, the leadership assessment, which is the grid. And the third are open-ended questions. And the general questions in the GMAC LOR are, how long have you, how do you rate amongst your peers? So that's asking them to assess kind of, based on other people they've worked with at similar work experiences, how do you rate amongst your peers? The second is a piece of constructive criticism or constructive feedback, and how you responded to that. And what they're really looking for is, are you teachable? Are you someone who takes feedback and will action on that feedback and improve and work to improve yourself? And the third are kind of an open-ended question, which is really kind of, is there anything else that you'd like to share? So this is somewhere where, if there's something that a recommender hasn't been able to cover in the first two questions, that they can cover in the kind of open-ended anything else. And generally the word counts that are associated with the common letter of rec, it's about 500 words per question. Some of the schools tighten those word counts up. And what we've heard from schools is that it's really a guidance, and they're trying to make it easier for recommenders so that recommenders don't feel like they need to write an entire book. But this is where they're trying to be supportive and make this as easy as they can for your recommenders through the process. Some other tips that might be helpful. I think I mentioned earlier, because each of these are web forms, as a recommender can write recommendation or write answers to the overall questions, and then in a Word doc or a Google doc and transfer those over just from a logistical standpoint. So a recommender doesn't think they need to produce, if you're applying to 5 schools, 5 completely different documents. The web form actually kind of lends itself and makes it easier from that standpoint. So wondering if we've got a couple minutes left, wondering if there's any other questions out there that I can answer for you. As some of the strongest recommendations that, I have, I think come from people who know you as an individual very well. So, if your recommender can speak to, how you have led and you give specific examples, this is where, schools are really looking for someone who understands you well and can speak to the details of what you've done, and providing examples in these answers are ways that they can really showcase other work that you've done. And it might be, a bullet on your resume, but they can really give the insight and talk about how helpful that was to them throughout the process. All right. Just trying to think of since there are no questions, what other words might be helpful. Other questions that I get on recommenders are, what is the, we talked about time frame a little bit, but if you're looking at round 2, a time frame, you probably don't want to start asking people for recommendations now. So again, that 6 to 8 week time frame. So if you're looking at January, that would be, with American holidays, if you are have anyone that is based in the US, or China with Chinese New Year, take those times into account. Diwali, there's all sorts of things going on. So as you're backing into those deadlines, you might want to add some additional time if there is a major holiday going on wherever you live, just to give these individuals enough time to be the strong recommender they can. So thank you very much for your time. And if you have any other questions, want to talk individually about your experience or your specific situation, please sign up for a consult. We love talking with individuals and helping you decide your best path. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.